I would say we might frame it sometimes as China is kicking our asses, but really, let's be honest here. What is happening is that China is oppressing their citizens and restricting their right to read. And their citizens have clearly got a desire here. And it's important to note that we have been here before. And since we're talking about timelines, I would like to go back to approximately 5th century BC, or whatever you want to call it. So this is important because it turns out that sometimes there's a relationship between real truth, like an objective thing, and how people of the day see that truth. So in this case, there was a guy who showed that the square root of 2 was a different class of numbers than the Pythagoreans appreciated, and they drowned him at sea. Right? Well, it turns out that Iran is repeating this story. And the reason that they are doing that is because, as I said earlier, they took the parameter P from our Diffie-Hellman handshake, and they basically said, if we see a TCP flow that includes this number, we're going to kill the TCP connection. We are going to say that that is not all right. So I was joking with Roger, instead of irrational numbers, we've created liberation numbers. And these numbers are being drowned at sea by different governments and corporations all around the world.
So there's actually a number right now. If you send that number after making an SSL connection in Iran, your connection gets killed.
Which is also kind of funny if you think about what you could do with JavaScript and websites. But ironically, they very clearly were targeting us. And if you look at things like the DigiNotar debacle or other cases where some Iranians have really owned up a bunch of certificate authorities that kind of deserved it, they very clearly have people that are working on this. Ironically, SOX proxying, as we note here, it really wasn't. So sometimes when things aren't blocked, there's a reason for it. And that largely comes from the fact that censorship of services is an effect that happens as a result of other actions, which is to say that censorship is a second-order effect of a surveillance state, right? Because they are watching, then they tamper. They tamper when watching is not enough. So using a straight SOX proxy is fine to let through in some cases because they believe that it doesn't harm things. It doesn't harm their surveillance program. So there's a lot of leeway here. If you can camouflage a protocol to look like another protocol, then it's very difficult for the classification systems to decide that it's a protocol that needs to be blocked. And lucky for us, the DH parameter P is a server-side parameter, so we just had a patch out in just a few hours, and the relays upgraded, and the whole Tor network worked all over again. And that's what it looked like. Each of these red dots here is a censorship event, and so they actually did these censorship events. You can see 3 here. You can see that they did them at particular times of the year that are actually, if we were to look at news stories, we would see that there's important political things happening here. So because we were able to get the patch out in a very quick amount of time, we were able to essentially help people who wanted to continue to use Tor, right? So I think the graph peaks at 12,000. So they went from making sure that 0 of those 12,000 were able to securely communicate, and then we got back up to 12,000. This is around the time, I mean, of course, this is not to take credit in any way for this happening. It's just to say that we're helping to create these alternative communications channels. And in this case, we see that they intentionally knew that something was sensitive, so they went to the trouble of working on blocking Tor. And then in this case, we were able to turn it around quickly enough that the demand was back during that particular time point, because it was sensitive. It was a time when people really thought about needing to be free from surveillance. Because this is a country where, when you log into your Gmail account, if they can do a man-in-the-middle attack on you, they will. And when they do the man-in-the-middle attack, they will take your email address, they will go to your house with the contents of your email, they will grab you, take you to the secret police office, and they will beat the shit out of you and torture you and potentially even murder you for the contents of your email. This is the same thing that's happening in Syria. So they really want to be able to spy on people, and then they prove to those people that they have this total view of your activity online. And Tor threatens that totalitarian control, and that is why they are attacking these things, because they are trying at the same time to attack their citizens specifically, and this gives their citizens something that gives them some of their agency and some of their autonomy, and it returns it. So when you run a Tor relay and you wish you could do something about this kind of stuff happening in the world, this is the kind of graph that should really inspire you to know that when you make a choice to do something like this, it actually does empower those people directly and immediately. And that keeps them safe. Can I keep going? Maybe this one.
So one other point here. I have a friend who's from Iran and does a bunch of trainings in Iran, and he tries to teach people about a lot of different circumvention tools. And a few years ago, he told me a story that I'm still trying to wrap my head around, so he said, I do trainings of lots of different tools. I've taught a lot of different people lots of different tools. Everybody that I've taught anything other than Tor to is now in jail. So now I only teach Tor, which is a pretty scary statement because we're not perfect. The other ones are not as good, but holy crap, we've got a lot of work to do.
So actually, if you write free software, could you raise your hand? Everybody here? It would be totally awesome if everybody if you're raising your hand right now, you should really consider coming and volunteering to work on Tor, because you'll make a huge difference in the world when you do that. I mean, no pressure or anything, but if you fuck it up, you know? We need good people to check our work. So Egypt is a place that's very near and dear to my heart. I did some trainings in the Middle East. I even studied Arabic very, very badly. I'm, non-existent. It's much worse than my German. In 2009, and I went to Egypt. I taught people about OTR. I taught people about how to use Jabber. I taught them about various different communication systems and how to use them safely. And at the time, I met some censors, and they told me, oh yeah, we use the Cisco gear, and we do deep packet inspection on enemies of the state. And yeah, well, I don't think too much about it, but obviously they're bad guys. So this is a pretty serious problem, but we tried our best to tell people in Egypt, look, surveillance is a big deal. You don't see it yet, but when you see it, it will be very bad because what someone can do is pretty serious. And so what happened in Egypt, of course, everyone knows, is that there was a revolution. And in fact, it's not that the revolution happened and it stopped on January 25th of this year. Rather, it is the case that the revolution is continuing nonstop, right? So this January 25th revolution is still going on right now. To hear, according to some of my friends that are in Cairo, covered with snipers. There are people that are being shot in the eyes. I mean, there's like a real serious thing going on in Egypt. And in the case of Mubarak pulling the plug on the internet, we saw that there was selective filtering. So for example, Twitter was filtered IP address by IP address. And so there was a case where a couple of the IP addresses were not filtered, and you could still sort of you could sort of reach some of them from some ISPs, and then sometimes you couldn't. But on Telecom Egypt data links, there were 2 IP addresses which were never filtered, but other ones on the same /24 that were. So you could prove without any question that they were filtering that right at the DSLAM for the DSL modem. And that's a pretty interesting fact. And in fact, I went to Egypt after January 25th again, and I was on a panel with someone from Nokia, Vodafone, Telecom Egypt, the head of the communications agency for Egypt, and I sat on this panel with them, which was a little bit awkward for them. And I said, now that the dictatorship is gone, I have talked to many people in Egypt that wish to ensure that the Egyptian constitution is something that you respect. So will you agree to never censor the internet again? Will you agree to never send propaganda for whichever regime tries to pop up next? And Vodafone made the usual arguments about pornography and all the other nonsense things about terrorism. And they don't talk about, for example, how their spreading of propaganda is in fact propagating state-based terrorism against individuals that live in Egypt. They just sort of gloss over that. And that's something you can't just stand and listen to. So I, of course, said, well, I have evidence that shows that you actively engaged in censorship. And the Telecom Egypt executive said, that's not true, you're wrong. And I said, no, I have the data, and I'd be happy to provide it in a court of law. I mean, I'm not really a fan of law, but in your case, I'll make an exception. And, I'd be happy to provide it. And he said, I'm not saying you're lying, but okay. And he stopped arguing with me because he knew damn well that he had specifically and selectively targeted certain things for censorship and that they had collaborated with the regime. And there would be a time of reckoning. And when that time came, it would not be pretty for him. We got this on videotape, by the way, which is pretty great. But of course, unplugging the internet sort of changes everything. And as we can see here, there was a demand, and then there was a drop. And that's pretty serious. They basically promised they won't do it again. However, and if you have a Vodafone SIM, you should consider contacting them about this. Vodafone said, we will do whatever the law says. Whatever is legal, they will do that. So what they basically said is, no matter what happens, we will do what we are told regardless of the consequences. It's not because we're afraid we'll be killed. It is because our corporate charter is perfectly aligned with the law. Right and wrong go with the law, hand in hand. And I confronted them repeatedly about this, and they continue to say that. That is not an acceptable standard of right and wrong, actually, and certainly not in a dictatorship where the rule of law is not controlled in any way through the consent of the people that are governed by this law. And it is really important to drive that home. These laws are bullshit, and we should disobey them. And these corporations should be punished by everybody for doing that.
So that was January. You'll notice that these slides are showing up more and more closely together at this point. In March, Libya, they didn't cut off the internet in the same way that Egypt did, but they might as well have. So there were a bunch of people who were starting to use it, and then they throttled everything. They didn't unplug it in a way that everybody in Egypt freaked out about. They just basically turned down the bandwidth knob so there was nothing left. And there are a few people back using it. Part of the challenge with Libya is they don't really have an internet there to begin with. So you'll notice the numbers here are hundreds of people coming from the Libyan IP space. Another challenge is when you get a geo-IP database, it doesn't really care about Libya very much because the people who build geo-IP databases are building them to sell them to corporations who sell televisions online. And if the person is not going to buy a television from you, who cares what country he's from? So it's challenging from our perspective to figure out which country some of these users are coming from. Another issue here, I was talking to somebody from Libya who said, the reason why you don't have most of us here is because we use sat phones that pop out as if we're from Italy. So hard to know how accurate the data is, but I think the general trend of lots of people deciding they need the internet getting throttled, and then slowly coming back exactly at the times of various political events is pretty interesting.
Yeah. So I think that Syria is a particularly egregious example of a fascist state when it comes to the internet. And in fact, you can look at an internet connection in a country and you can sort of tell in general how free the country might be in terms of how people who govern the telecom infrastructure think that people should be, and effectively what regular people are free to do online. And Syria is an example